My phone buzzed against the cold marble countertop at exactly 7:12 in the morning. I stared at the screen and felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. It was my father, Reginald. He never called this early unless he wanted money or to gloat about something. I slid the answer button and tapped the speaker icon, setting the phone down next to my half-empty cup of black coffee. Dominique, his voice boomed through the speaker, cold and detached. I have news. Your grandfather Elijah died last night. The funeral is set for Friday. I froze, my hand hovering over my mug, but I did not freeze from grief. I froze from the sheer audacity of the lie. He left us everything, my father continued, his voice gaining a sickening tone of triumph. The house, the land, the investments. It is all ours. And just so we are clear, you get nothing. Before I could even process the cruelty of his words, I heard a sound in the background that made my blood run cold. It was laughter. My mother Beatrice was cackling. It was a high, shrill sound like a witch celebrating a successful curse. Finally, she shouted from the background, her voice clear as day. Finally, you are out of the picture, old man. Now we can really live. I did not argue. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply stared across the kitchen island. Sitting right there in his favorite checkered pajamas was Grandpa Elijah. He was alive. He was breathing. He was calmly eating a bowl of oatmeal with sliced bananas, just as he had done every morning for the past 20 years. He held a spoon in his right hand halfway to his mouth. In his left hand, he clutched a sealed manila envelope stamped with the logo of his private attorney. Grandpa had heard every single word. His hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from a rage so deep it looked like it hurt physically. He slowly lowered the spoon back into the bowl. The clinking of the silver against the ceramic sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He looked at me, his eyes watering but his jaw set tight. I opened my mouth to speak, to expose their lie, to tell my father that he was talking to a ghost that could still bite back. But Grandpa Elijah shook his head. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling me to stay silent. He wanted to hear it. He needed to hear it. He leaned in closer to the phone, his face hardening into a mask of stone. He wanted to know exactly how much his own son hated him. Before I tell you how we planned the most satisfying revenge in family history, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the only one standing by a loved one when everyone else turned their back. To understand why I sat there in silence while my parents danced on a grave that did not exist, you have to go back exactly 24 hours. It started with a clerical error at St. Mary's Hospital. A homeless man, also named Elijah Brooks, had passed away in the emergency room from a cardiac arrest. The hospital administration, overworked and understaffed, made a lazy assumption. They saw the name in their system and called the first next of kin listed for an Elijah Brooks. That happened to be my father. When the hospital called my father yesterday afternoon, I was actually at his house dropping off some tax documents he was too lazy to file himself. I watched him look at the phone. I saw the hospital caller ID. He did not answer. He silenced the call and went back to his online poker game on his tablet. They will call back if it is important, he had muttered, eyes glued to the digital cards. I had a bad feeling. A granddaughter's intuition. So I called the hospital back myself from the hallway. When the nurse told me Elijah Brooks had passed, I nearly collapsed. I rushed to the hospital, tears streaming down my face, only to find the mistake when I arrived at the morgue. The man lying there was a stranger. My grandfather was alive. He had been at the hospital for a routine checkup and was waiting in the cafeteria sipping tea, wondering why no one had come to pick him up. I found him. I hugged him so hard I nearly broke his ribs. We laughed about the mix-up. It was a funny story. A relief. I pulled out my phone to call my father and tell him the good news. I wanted to tell him that his father was okay, that it was all a big mistake. But then, as I drove Grandpa back to my parents' house to surprise them, we saw something that made us stop the car down the street. My father was standing on the porch on the phone with a real estate agent. I rolled down the window and the wind carried his voice clearly to us. Yes, the old man is dead, my father was saying, his voice buzzing with excitement. We want to list the house immediately. I know the market is hot. We can have it on the market by Monday. Cash offers only. Grandpa Elijah sat in the passenger seat of my car, his hands gripping his knees. He watched his son, the boy he had raised, the boy he had put through college, trying to sell his home before his body was even supposedly cold. Wait, Grandpa whispered, his voice cracking. Do not go in there, Dominique. But Grandpa, I said, reaching for the door handle, we have to tell them. No, he commanded, a tear rolling down his weathered cheek. Drive me to your house. If they think I am dead, let them think I am dead. I want to see how far they will go. I want to see who they really are when they think no one is watching. So I drove him to my place. We installed cameras. We waited. And now, sitting in my kitchen eating oatmeal while my mother laughed about his death, Grandpa Elijah was about to get the show of a lifetime. I adjusted the volume on my laptop so Grandpa would not miss a single word of the betrayal unfolding in high definition on the screen. On the monitor, my parents were standing in their living room, which was already decorated with overpriced furniture they could barely afford. My father, Reginald, held a bottle of Dom Perignon. It was the vintage kind that cost $300 a bottle. He did not look like a man who had just received news of his father's death. He looked like a man who had just won the Powerball lottery. With a loud pop, the cork flew across the room and hit the wall. To new beginnings, Reginald shouted, raising his crystal flute in the air. To the old man, finally kicking the bucket and leaving us the keys to the kingdom. My mother, Beatrice, clinked her glass against his, her face flushed with excitement. I hope you called the broker, Reginald. We need to liquidate that dusty old farm as soon as the death certificate is signed. I am not driving that leased Mercedes anymore. I want my own title. I watched Grandpa Elijah out of the corner of my eye. He was gripping the edge of the kitchen table so hard his knuckles were turning white. The farm they were talking about was 40 acres of land he had bought with his bare hands 50 years ago. It was the land where he taught me how to ride a bike, and where we planted peach trees every summer. To my father, it was just a down payment on a Bentley Bentayga. 40 acres is going to fetch a premium, my father bragged, taking a large gulp of the expensive wine. I already looked up the listing price. Once we sell the land and the commercial properties downtown, we are looking at $5 million liquid cash. I am going to the dealership on Monday. Beatrice laughed, a cruel sound that made my stomach turn. She began pacing around the room, scanning the shelves like a vulture looking for scraps. She stopped in front of the fireplace mantel. There in the center stood a beautiful silver frame. It held a black and white photograph of Grandpa Elijah holding me when I was just a baby. It was the only professional portrait we had of him, laughing genuinely. Beatrice picked up the frame and frowned. She held it with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated with a disease. This has to go, she muttered. What is wrong with it? My father asked, pouring himself a second glass. It ruins the vibe, Beatrice said. It is bad feng shui to have pictures of dead people in the living area. It brings down the energy of the room. We need space for that modern art piece I saw at the gallery. Besides, looking at his face makes me feel guilty about how much money we are about to spend. She did not put the picture in a box. She did not set it aside to give to me. My mother walked over to the tall stainless steel trash can in the kitchen, pressed the foot pedal, and dropped the silver frame into the garbage. The sound of the glass shattering against the bottom of the bin echoed through the speakers. Out with the old, in with the new, she dusted her hands off and took another sip of champagne. Beside me, Grandpa Elijah let out a long, shaky breath. He did not say a word, but I saw a single tear slide down his cheek. He reached out and closed the laptop screen. He had seen enough. The sadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the fierce businessman who had built an empire from nothing. Open the laptop back up, Dominique, he said, his voice steady and low. Record everything. If they want bad energy, I will show them exactly what a storm looks like. The front door of my parents' house slammed open, and in walked Trey, my 28-year-old brother, the golden child, the prince of the family. He was wearing designer sunglasses indoors and carrying a gym bag that probably cost more than my first car. He did not look like a man who had just lost his grandfather. He looked like a man who was inconvenienced by the interruption to his schedule. "Yo, Mom," Trey shouted, dropping his bag on the floor without a care. "I see." Sad news about the old man. Did anyone find his ledger yet? He told me he bought Bitcoin back in 2013. I need that hard drive before the estate lawyers lock everything up. That wallet could be worth millions, and I have investors waiting on me. He did not ask how my father was feeling. He did not ask about the funeral arrangements. He did not even ask if Grandpa had suffered. His first thought was about a cryptocurrency password. On the screen, I watched my mother Beatrice rush toward him. She did not scold him for his insensitivity. She did not tell him to show some respect for the dead. Instead, she wrapped him in a hug so tight you would think he had just returned from war. "Oh, my poor baby," she cooed, stroking his hair. "You must be so stressed. Do not worry about the money. Your father and I are handling the assets. We will make sure you get your share for your startup. Come sit down. I made your favorite." She led him to the kitchen island where a plate of filet mignon and garlic mashed potatoes was waiting. It was steaming hot. She had timed her cooking perfectly for his arrival. I watched him dig into the steak and I felt a familiar burn in my chest. It was the burn of hunger. A memory flashed in my mind so vivid it made my hands shake. I was 16 years old. I had just come home from a double shift at the diner where I worked to save money for college. I was exhausted and starving. I had opened the fridge hoping to find leftovers. My mother had walked in, snatched the plate from my hand, and threw it in the trash. "The kitchen is closed, Dominique," she had told me, her eyes cold and unfeeling. "If you are hungry, you should have come home earlier. We do not waste food on people who cannot follow a schedule." I had gone to bed that night with a stomach that growled so loud it kept me awake. I ate stale crackers in the dark. But here was Trey, a grown man of 28, who had never worked a real job in his life, being hand-fed steak because he was sad about not finding a Bitcoin wallet. Grandpa Elijah leaned forward in his chair next to me. He was watching the screen intently. He had always defended Trey. He had always made excuses for him, saying that Trey was just young and spirited. But now, seeing his grandson chew with his mouth open, talking about selling off the legacy before the body was even buried, the illusion was shattering. "This steak is a little dry, Mom," Trey complained, pushing the plate away. "And where is the wine? I thought we were celebrating the inheritance." Beatrice did not get angry. She apologized. She actually apologized to him. "I am so sorry, sweetie," she said, rushing to pour him a glass of the expensive champagne. "Let me get you some sauce. You deserve the best. We are finally going to be rich enough to treat you like the king you are." Grandpa Elijah let out a low growl. It was a sound of pure disgust. He finally saw what I had known my entire life. To them, Trey was the investment. I was just the overhead cost. And they were about to learn that cutting costs sometimes leads to total bankruptcy. Just when I thought the nausea could not get any worse, the front door swung open for the third time. In walked Amber, my sister-in-law. She was a woman who treated our family gatherings like anthropological expeditions, observing us rather than actually being part of the family. She was dressed in a pristine cream-colored yoga outfit, holding a green juice, looking less like someone coming to comfort a grieving husband, and more like a project manager, arriving to inspect a construction site. Amber was the kind of person who smiled with her mouth but never with her eyes. She walked straight past my mother, who was still pouring champagne, and went directly to Trey. She did not hug him. She did not offer a tearful embrace. She simply placed a manicured hand on his shoulder and spoke loud enough for the microphone to pick up every syllable. "Babe, please tell me we secured the deed. I have my interior designer on hold for Monday morning, and she is fully booked until September. We cannot lose our slot." Trey looked up from his steak and grinned. "Don't worry, babe. The old man is gone. The house is basically ours." Amber let out a sigh of relief and turned to survey the living room. Her blue eyes scanned the space with a look of critical disdain. She walked over to the corner where Grandpa Elijah's vintage leather armchair sat. It was the chair he had bought with his first big paycheck as a contractor 50 years ago. It was worn and cracked in places, but it held the history of a man who built a legacy from dirt. Amber wrinkled her nose as if she smelled something rotting. "God, this place needs a detox," she announced, waving her hand in front of her face. "It smells like old people and struggle in here. Trey promised me the first thing we do is call a dumpster service. We need to gut this entire house. All of this junk needs to go." She gestured vaguely at the shelves filled with first edition books and hand-carved sculptures my grandfather had collected from his travels to Africa. Finally, she continued, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. "I can finally help you guys elevate your lifestyle. We are going to get rid of all this heavy, dark furniture and replace it with something light and Scandinavian. Minimalist. Clean. Civilized. It is time to wash away the past and bring this family into the modern world. No more holding on to things just because they are old. It is honestly embarrassing." Beside me in my kitchen, Grandpa Elijah went rigid. His breathing became shallow and fast. I reached out and covered his trembling hand with mine. He was watching a woman who had never worked a day in her life call his life's work embarrassing junk. He was watching her plan to erase his history because it did not fit her beige aesthetic. Amber turned to my mother and flashed a bright fake smile. "Beatrice, honey, do not worry. I will handle the estate sale. We will sell what we can to the locals and trash the rest. By the time the funeral is over, this house will be a blank canvas, ready for us to fix." Grandpa Elijah stared at the screen, his eyes burning with a cold, intense fire. He slowly pulled his hand from under mine and picked up his pen. He wrote a single sentence on the notepad in front of him. "She wants a blank canvas. I will leave her with nothing but the frame." The screen on my laptop flickered with the grainy black and white feed from the security cameras installed at the front gate of Grandpa Elijah's estate. It was barely 8 in the evening, but the darkness seemed thicker tonight, as if the universe itself was trying to hide the shame of what was about to happen. Grandpa sat next to me in his wheelchair, his eyes glued to the monitor. He was holding a cup of tea, but his hand was shaking so badly that the liquid rippled like a tiny storm. "Here they come," he whispered, his voice barely audible. 2 sets of headlights cut through the darkness, blinding the camera lens for a moment. It was my parents' SUV, followed closely by Trey's flashy sports car. They did not park in the driveway like civilized guests. They pulled right up onto the pristine lawn, leaving deep tire tracks in the grass that Grandpa had tended to meticulously for 40 years. They got out of the cars and I felt a surge of nausea. They were not wearing black. They were not carrying flowers or looking somber. My father Reginald walked around to the trunk of his car and pulled out a heavy sledgehammer. He did not even try to look for the spare key under the mat. He did not try to call a locksmith. He marched up to the front door, the beautiful hand-carved oak door that Grandpa had imported from Europe in the 70s, and swung the hammer with all his might. The sound of the wood splintering echoed through the speakers on my laptop. Crack, smash, crack. Grandpa flinched with every blow as if the hammer were hitting his own body. "That door," he murmured. "Your grandmother chose that door. She loved the way the morning light came through the stained glass." With one final violent swing, the antique lock gave way. The door swung open, banging against the interior wall. My family did not walk inside. They poured in like a swarm of locusts. My mother Beatrice was the first one through the threshold. She did not take off her muddy shoes. She marched straight onto the Persian rug in the foyer, a rug that was older than she was, and began pointing at things. "Grab the silver from the dining room," she shouted to Trey, "and check the drawers in the hallway for cash. Old people always hide cash in socks or books." Trey ran past her, whooping with excitement. He looked like a child in a candy store where everything was free. "I got the living room," he yelled. "I am taking the big TV and the sound system." Amber walked in last. She stopped in the middle of the foyer and looked around with a sneer. She pulled out her phone and started recording a video for her social media. "So guys, we are finally inside the spooky mansion," she narrated, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It is so sad that Grandpa passed, but honestly, this place is a gold mine. We are going to have to do so much work to make it livable, but at least the bones are good." Inheritance. Hashtag new project. I watched Grandpa Elijah. He was not crying anymore. He was staring at the screen with a look of absolute devastation. He was watching the people he raised, the people he fed and clothed, desecrate his sanctuary before his body was even supposedly in the ground. They were not looking for photos to remember him by. They were looking for things to pawn. "Turn up the volume," Dominique, Grandpa said. "I want to hear every single thing they break." I turned the sound up just in time to hear the crash of porcelain. My mother had knocked over a vase in her haste to get to the dining room. "Oops," she laughed. "Well, it was ugly anyway. Add it to the trash pile." That vase was a gift from me for their 30th anniversary. Watching my mother kick the shards aside with her heel, something inside me snapped. But I looked at Grandpa and saw that his sorrow was hardening into something else. It was no longer grief. It was the cold steel resolve of a general preparing for war. They had broken into his house, but they had just locked themselves out of his heart forever. The camera feed switched to the library. This room was the heart of the house, the place where Grandpa Elijah had taught me how to read, and where he had taught me the history they did not put in my school textbooks. It was lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with first-edition literature, leather-bound legal texts, and a collection of jazz vinyls that was the envy of collectors across the state. The air in that room always smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco, a scent that made me feel safe. But watching Amber stand in the center of that sanctuary made my skin crawl. She was flanked by two movers holding large, heavy-duty black trash bags. She looked at the shelves not with reverence but with disgust. She reached out and pulled a book from the shelf. It was a signed copy of a memoir from a civil rights leader, a man Grandpa had actually marched with in Selma. Amber flipped through the pages carelessly, bending the spine. "This is just too heavy," she said, tossing the book into the open trash bag held by the mover. "It is all so depressing and political. We want a house that feels light and airy. Nobody wants to read about struggles from 50 years ago while they are trying to relax." Grandpa Elijah gasped beside me. He did not shout. It was a sharp intake of breath, as if he had been punched in the gut. That book was not just paper and ink. It was his youth. It was his blood. It was the proof of his survival. Amber moved to the corner where the record player sat. Next to it were crates of vinyl records. John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Billie Holiday. Original pressings that were worth thousands of dollars, but were priceless in cultural value. "Get rid of all this scratching noise too," Amber commanded, waving her hand dismissively. "It takes up too much space. We can put a nice Bluetooth speaker here and maybe a faux fiddle leaf fig tree. I want this room to be a yoga studio, or maybe a meditation space. All this old black history is just bringing down the property value. It feels like a museum for old people." I watched as the movers began shoveling the records into the bags. The sound of the vinyl clashing together was sickening. They were treating art like garbage. They were treating my grandfather's soul like clutter. Amber pulled out her phone again to record another update for her followers. "Guys, you would not believe the amount of hoarding we have to deal with," she whispered into the camera, making a sad face. "It is going to take weeks to clear out all this old junk so we can make space for positive energy. But sometimes you have to clear out the past to make room for the future, right?" She was not just cleaning a house. She was whitewashing a legacy. She was actively erasing the identity of the man who built the roof over her head. Grandpa Elijah turned his wheelchair away from the screen. He could not watch anymore. His hands were trembling, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "She calls it junk," he said quietly. "She thinks she can throw my life into a plastic bag and replace it with a plastic tree." He turned back to me, and for the first time I saw a dangerous glint in his eye. It was the look of a man who was done being sad and was ready to teach a lesson. "Let her clear the room, Dominique," he said. "Let her paint it white. Let her make it perfect. Because when I take it back, I want her to see exactly what she lost. I want her to know that she can throw away my books, but she can never erase who owns the deed. They are not just stealing my things anymore. They are trying to steal my dignity, and that is a debt I will collect with interest. The sound of the industrial drill echoed through the speakers of my laptop, like a dentist drill hitting a raw nerve. It was a violent mechanical scream that made Grandpa Elijah wince beside me. My father Reginald was sweating profusely, his face red with exertion, as he bore into the steel lock of the vintage floor safe in the corner of the study. He looked less like a grieving son and more like a desperate bank robber who was running out of time. Beside him, my mother Beatrice was pacing back and forth, wringing her hands, not in anxiety, but in greedy anticipation. "Hurry up, Reginald," she hissed, her eyes darting to the window. "The neighbors might hear the noise. Just get it open before someone calls the police." With a final metallic groan, the lock gave way. The heavy iron door swung open. My family huddled around the opening like a pack of wolves descending on a fresh kill. They did not look for sentimental items. They did not look for the letters my grandmother had written to him during the war, or the medal he received for community service. Their hands grasped for the leather-bound documents stacked neatly inside. "Got it!" my father shouted, pulling out a thick envelope. He ripped the wax seal open with trembling fingers, tearing the paper in his haste. "It is the last will and testament." He scanned the pages, his eyes widening with manic delight. "Listen to this." He cleared his throat and read aloud, forcing a tone of solemnity that was completely fake. "I, Elijah Brooks, being of sound mind and body, hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all real estate holdings and liquid assets, to my only son, Reginald Brooks." The room erupted. Trey pumped his fist in the air, shouting about his new startup capital. Amber clapped her hands giddily, already calculating the renovation budget. My mother let out a scream of joy that sounded more like a banshee wail. "We did it," she cried, hugging my father over the open safe. "We are finally free of that old miser's control. We are rich, Reginald. We are actually rich." They began passing the document around, treating it like a holy scripture. They hugged. They high-fived. My father looked at the ceiling and whispered, "Thank you, Dad. I knew you loved me deep down." I watched them celebrate on the screen, and I felt a strange mix of pity and amusement. They were popping champagne over a piece of paper that was worth less than the napkin under my coffee cup. Grandpa Elijah leaned back in his wheelchair and took a slow, calm sip of his tea. He looked at the date on the document my father was waving around. "That will is dated October 12th, 2014, he said, his voice dry. "That was the year I thought Reginald had finally quit gambling. It was before he stole my identity to buy a boat. What they did not know was that the document they were celebrating had been revoked 7 years ago. Under state law, a new will automatically nullifies any previous versions. And the real will, the one that superseded everything, was currently sitting in a fireproof vault at the law offices of Henderson and Clark downtown. That document did not mention Reginald, Beatrice, or Trey. They were dancing on the deck of the Titanic, convinced they had just been promoted to captain. They had no idea that the iceberg was already scraping against the hull, and I was the one steering the ship. "Enjoy the party," I whispered to the screen, "because the hangover is going to be lethal." The feed switched to the detached garage. This was not just a place to park cars. It was a museum. The floor was polished concrete, and the lighting was designed to showcase the single vehicle resting under a custom-made silk tarp. It was Grandpa Elijah's pride and joy, a cherry-red 1965 Cadillac DeVille convertible. He had restored it himself piece by piece over the course of 10 years. It was the car he drove my grandmother to church in every Sunday until the day she passed away. It was not just a car. It was a time capsule of their love. Trey walked into the garage whistling a tune. He did not look at the tools hanging neatly on the wall. He did not appreciate the smell of oil and wax. He walked straight to the pegboard, where Grandpa kept the spare keys. He grabbed the heavy brass keychain and twirled it around his finger like a toy. "Jackpot," he muttered. He walked over to the car and yanked the silk tarp off in one violent motion, sending dust motes dancing into the air. He did not walk around to admire the chrome or the white wall tires. He just wanted to get inside. He opened the heavy driver's side door and threw himself onto the pristine white leather seats. He was wearing jeans with metal rivets on the back pockets, and I watched in horror as he slid across the vintage upholstery. I knew he was scratching the leather that Grandpa conditioned by hand every month. Trey jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life. It was a deep, guttural growl that shook the camera lens. A cloud of blue smoke puffed out of the exhaust pipe. A sensible person would let a vintage engine warm up. But Trey was not sensible. He slammed his foot down on the gas pedal, revving the engine until it screamed. The tachometer needle must have been in the red. "Let's see what this boat can do," he shouted over the noise. He shifted the gear into reverse without looking. He did not check the mirrors. He just stomped on the gas. The sound that followed was agonizing. It was the high-pitched shriek of metal scraping against metal. Trey had miscalculated the width of the door frame. The passenger side of the Cadillac scraped violently against the metal track of the garage door. Grandpa Elijah flinched beside me as if someone had cut his own skin. He closed his eyes tight. Trey slammed on the brakes. He did not look worried. He did not look guilty. He looked annoyed. He put the car in park and stepped out to look at the damage. A deep white gash ran along the entire length of the rear fender, ruining the flawless red paint job. "My bad," he shrugged. "That will buff out." He did not apologize to the spirit of his grandfather. Instead, he pulled out his phone. He walked around to the front of the car, hiding the scratch he just made, and started an Instagram live. "Yo, what is up, guys?" Trey said, putting on his influencer voice. "Check out the new whip. My grandpa just passed away and left me this classic. Rest in peace, old man, but thanks for the upgrade. We are going to put some hydraulics on this baby and paint it matte black. Stay tuned for the transformation. Hashtag new car nashtag inheritance." Grandpa opened his eyes. He stared at the screen where his grandson was leaning against the hood of the car, disrespecting everything it stood for. "He thinks it is his car." Grandpa said, his voice dangerously calm. "But he forgot one thing. I never transferred the title to the estate. That car is still registered to me personally." I looked at Grandpa and realized the trap had just snapped shut. That means, I said slowly, that he did not just inherit a car. He just stole a car. And since he drove it out of the garage and damaged it, we have him on camera committing grand theft auto and destruction of property. Grandpa nodded slowly. "Let him drive it around the block," he said. "The police are going to love that live stream footage." I parked my car on the street, ensuring I did not block the driveway my father had already cluttered with his SUV. Walking up the long paved path to the front porch felt like walking into a crime scene. The beautiful oak door was still hanging off its hinges from where my father had taken a sledgehammer to it an hour ago. Through the splintered gap, I could hear the sounds of my childhood home being ransacked. I heard drawers being ripped open. I heard the crash of objects being tossed into boxes. I heard laughter. It sounded less like a family in mourning and more like a chaotic frat party. I stepped onto the porch, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. I needed to play the role of the grieving, confused granddaughter. I needed to get close enough to record their faces and their words. But before I could even cross the threshold, a figure stepped into the broken doorway, blocking my path. It was Amber. She was holding a glass of Grandpa's vintage port wine in one hand and a clipboard in the other. She looked at me, not with sympathy, but with the annoyance of a bouncer dealing with an uninvited guest at an exclusive club. "Dominique," she said, her voice flat and cold. "What are you doing here?" "I just wanted to see the house," I said, trying to keep my voice trembling. "I wanted to be with family. I wanted to help organize Grandpa's things." Amber let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She took a sip of the wine, swirling it around in the glass as she looked me up and down. "Organize," she repeated with a sneer. "Is that what you call it? Look, let us be real for a second. We know why you are here. You heard about the will. You heard that Reginald gets everything, and you are trying to swoop in and grab a few trinkets before we inventory them. She took a step forward, forcing me to take a step back. She was physically pushing me off the property. This is a private family matter, Dominique, she said, emphasizing the word family, as if it were a club I did not have the credentials to enter. Your father and I are conducting a sensitive financial audit. We cannot have outsiders wandering around getting emotional and pocketing valuable items. I stared at her. I was the one who mowed the lawn here every summer. I was the one who cooked Thanksgiving dinner in that kitchen for 10 years. She had married into this family 3 years ago and had visited this house exactly twice. I am an outsider. I asked quietly, my hand tightening around the strap of my bag, where my recorder was running. I am his granddaughter Amber. I am his blood. Amber rolled her eyes. Blood does not pay the estate taxes, honey, she said. The will leaves everything to your father. That makes me the lady of the house now, and honestly, your energy is just very heavy right now. We are trying to focus on the future and the renovation. You are just a reminder of the depressing past. She leaned against the doorframe, looking down at me from the elevated porch. Go home, Dominique. Go back to your little apartment. If we find anything in the junk pile that looks like something you would wear, I will have Trey drop it off at Goodwill for you. But do not come back here until the funeral, and even then, try not to make a scene. She turned around and slammed the broken door in my face. The latch did not catch because the wood was destroyed, but the message was clear. Back at the safe house, I knew Grandpa Elijah was watching this. He was watching the woman who married his grandson for money kick his own flesh and blood off his porch. He was watching the final confirmation that without him, I was nothing to them but a nuisance. I turned and walked back to my car, not in defeat but in anticipation. Amber thought she had just closed the door on me. She had no idea she had just locked herself inside a burning building. I managed to step past Amber into the foyer before she could physically shove me off the porch. The house was in chaos. It looked less like a home and more like a looting site. My father, Reginald, was standing in the hallway holding a box of Grandpa's vintage silverware. I started to ask him about the funeral arrangements, but before I could get the words out, Trey walked out of the kitchen. He was holding a large cup of bright purple grape soda without a lid. He was staring at his phone, scrolling through social media and laughing at his own posts. He did not see the stack of books they had carelessly thrown on the floor. He tripped over a leather-bound encyclopedia. The cup flew out of his hand. The purple liquid splashed violently across the pristine oak floorboards. It splattered onto the baseboards and soaked into the expensive Persian rug. Some of it landed on my suede boots. Trey did not apologize. He did not rush to get a towel. He looked at the mess and let out an annoyed sigh. Yo, who put these books here, he complained. I almost ruined my new Jordans. My mother Beatrice rushed in from the dining room. She saw the purple puddle spreading on the wood. She did not yell at Trey for being clumsy. She did not worry about the antique rug. She looked at me. Her eyes were cold and filled with a lifetime of resentment. Dominique, clean that up, she commanded, pointing a manicured finger at the floor. I stared at her in disbelief. Excuse me? I asked, my voice steady despite the rage boiling in my chest. You heard me, she snapped. Trey cannot be slipping on that wet floor. He has a sensitive ankle. Besides, you are used to this kind of work, aren't you? I mean, you have always been the worker bee of the family. You know how to scrub. It will be good practice for when you go back to your little apartment. She kicked a roll of paper towels toward me. It rolled across the floor and stopped in the middle of the puddle, soaking up the purple soda. Get on your knees and wipe it up, she said, and do not leave a sticky residue. I stood there for a moment. I am a senior negotiator for a global firm. I manage mergers worth billions of dollars. But in this house, I was lower than the dirt. I looked up at the corner of the foyer ceiling. The tiny black lens of the hidden security camera was blinking. I needed this footage. I needed the judge to see exactly who these people were. I slowly lowered myself to my knees. The hardwood was unforgiving against my skin. I reached out and grabbed the soggy paper towels. I began to wipe the floor at my mother's feet. Trey stood over me watching. He took a sip from a fresh can of soda he had pulled from his pocket. "You missed a spot right there," he said, using the toe of his sneaker to nudge my hand. My father watched the whole scene and said nothing. He just turned back to his box of silverware. I cleaned in silence. I wiped up every drop. My knees were bruised, my hands were sticky. But as I stood up, I felt powerful. I had just secured the final piece of evidence to prove emotional abuse in court. "Good girl," my mother said, turning her back on me. "Now get out. We have real business to discuss, and we do not need the help listening in." I walked out the door without a word. They thought they had broken me. They had no idea they had just handed me the hammer. I stepped out onto the back patio, trying to calm the shaking in my hands from the humiliation of cleaning the floor. The night air was cool, but the atmosphere inside the house was toxic. I was about to walk to my car when I heard a voice coming from the shadows of the garden gazebo. It was my father, Reginald. He was not mourning. He was not reflecting on his loss. He was pacing back and forth with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a mixture of desperation and arrogance. I crouched behind a large azalea bush and pulled out my phone. I hit record. "Listen to me, Silas," my father hissed into the phone. "I do not care about the interest rate. I need the 500,000 in my account by tomorrow morning. Yes, cash wire." I held my breath. Silas was a name I recognized from my days working in distressed asset management. He was not a banker. He was a hard money lender, a polite term for a loan shark who broke kneecaps when payments were late. My father continued wiping sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "The collateral is the estate, Silas. The house alone is appraised at 3.2 million. I am the sole heir. The old man kicked the bucket last night, and I am looking at the will right now." He was lying. He did not have the deed. He did not have a probate letter. He was trying to secure a high-risk loan using a property he did not legally own yet, based on a will that was invalid. In the eyes of the law, this was mortgage fraud. It was a felony. I heard the tinny voice on the other end of the line ask for proof of ownership. "I will send you a picture of the will right now," Reginald promised, his voice trembling with greed. "Just send the contract. I will sign whatever you want. I need to pay off the bookie and put a down payment on the penthouse before the market turns." So that was it. He was not borrowing money to pay for the funeral. He was borrowing money to cover his secret gambling debts and to fund a lifestyle he could not afford. He was willing to risk his father's legacy, his father's home, for a quick cash injection. He was gambling with a house that still belonged to a living man. I watched him hang up the phone and let out a sigh of relief. He smiled into the darkness, thinking he had just pulled off a masterstroke of financial maneuvering. He thought he was being a shrewd businessman. But as I stopped the recording, I knew the truth. My father had just sold his soul to the devil for a down payment. He had just signed a contract with a shark using bait that belonged to a whale. And when Silas came to collect and found out the collateral was not available, he would not be looking for the house. He would be looking for Reginald. I walked back to my car feeling a strange sense of calm. I did not need to destroy my father. He had just put a price on his own head. All I had to do was wait for the check to bounce. I sat in the driver's seat of my car and locked the doors. The silence inside the vehicle was a sharp contrast to the chaotic noise of my family looting the house just a few yards away. My hands were no longer shaking. The humiliation I had felt scrubbing the floor was gone, replaced by a cold, icy clarity. My father thought he was a genius for securing a loan from a shark like Silas. He thought he had bought himself time, but in reality he had just placed his head on a chopping block and handed me the axe. I pulled out my secure work phone, the one I used for international mergers and high-stakes acquisitions. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Marcus. Marcus was not just a lawyer. He was a fixer. He was the man my firm called when we needed to acquire a distressed asset quietly without the market knowing. He answered on the first ring. Dominique, it is late. Everything okay? I need you to make a purchase for me. I said, my voice steady and professional. Tonight. Right now. I heard the sound of a keyboard clacking in the background. Marcus was already working. Name the asset, he said. It is a promissory note, I explained. A private high-risk loan just issued by Silas Thorne. The borrower is Reginald Brooks. The principal is $500,000. The typing stopped. Your father Marcus asked, his voice dropping an octave. Dominique, are you sure about this? Silas is dangerous. If your father defaults on a loan with him, he is not going to default with Silas, I interrupted. He is going to default with me. I want you to call Silas immediately. Offer him $550,000 cash for the note. Tell him a private equity firm is interested in the underlying real estate collateral and wants to hold the paper. Silas is a businessman. He will take a quick 10% profit over the risk of chasing a gambler for months. There was a pause on the line. I could hear Marcus processing the strategy. He knew exactly what I was doing. I was not paying off my father's debt to save him. I was buying the debt to own him. I will set up the shell company, Marcus said. Let us call it Nemesis Holdings. I will wire the funds to Silas within the hour. By midnight, you will be the legal holder of your father's mortgage. Make sure the transfer of assignment is airtight, I commanded. When I foreclose, I do not want any loopholes. Consider it done, Marcus said. And Dominique, remind me never to get on your bad side. I hung up the phone and looked back at the house. Through the living room window, I could see my father laughing and pouring another glass of champagne. He was celebrating the money he thought he had just tricked a loan shark into giving him. He had no idea that the money had actually come from his daughter. He had no idea that the shark he feared had just been eaten by a much bigger predator. My phone buzzed with a text notification from my banking app. Transfer complete. $550,000 debited. A cruel smile touched my lips. I did not just own the debt. I owned the leverage. My father had used Grandpa Elijah's house as collateral for a loan he could never repay. Now, if he missed a single payment, if he stepped one toe out of line, I had the legal right to take everything he had. The house, his car, his dignity. I started the engine and backed out of the driveway. As I drove away into the night, I felt a sense of peace I had not felt in years. They had spent my whole life treating me like I was worthless. They treated me like a servant, but they forgot the golden rule of business. Never mistreat the person who holds the checkbook. The game had officially changed. They were playing checkers, but I had just bought the entire chessboard. The surveillance feed zoomed in on the dining room table where my family was conducting what looked like a business meeting. My father Reginald held a glossy brochure from the funeral home in one hand and a calculator in the other. He looked at the prices with a scowl, the same expression he used when he found a scratch on his car. $5,000 for a mahogany casket, he spat, throwing the brochure onto the table. That is absolute robbery. The man is dead, Beatrice. He does not need satin lining, he needs a hole in the ground. My mother took a sip of her wine and nodded in agreement. Her face showed zero sign of grief, only annoyance at the inconvenience of the expense. Just pick the direct cremation package, Reginald, she said, waving her hand dismissively. The basic one. It is only $600. It comes with a cardboard container and a plastic bag for the ashes. Nobody is going to see it anyway. But what do we tell people, my father asked. Everyone expects a viewing. The old man was a pillar of the community. My mother smiled a cold, calculating smile that made my blood freeze. We will tell them it was a rare infectious strain, she said smoothly. Something highly contagious. We will say the hospital mandated an immediate sealed cremation for public safety. It solves the problem of us not actually having a body, and it saves us $4,000. It is a win-win. I looked at Grandpa Elijah sitting beside me. He was staring at the screen, watching his own son haggle over the price of burning him. He looked down at his hands, his eyes filled with a quiet heartbreak. They were willing to throw him in a cardboard box, like an old pair of shoes, to save money. But the moment the conversation shifted to the reception, the budget constraints suddenly vanished. Amber pulled out her iPad and pulled up the catering menu. "Okay, so we saved money on the disposal," she said, using the word disposal as if Grandpa were a bag of trash. "That means we have more room in the budget for the alcohol. We absolutely cannot serve domestic beer. This is a networking event. All the investors are going to be there. We need top shelf." "Put us down for the platinum bar package," my father told the caterer on the speakerphone, his voice suddenly cheerful. "Yes, the one with the Grey Goose vodka and the 20-year-old scotch. And make sure the hors d'oeuvres are seafood heavy. We want the lobster sliders and the truffle oil fries." I did the math in my head. They were spending $600 on my grandfather and $15,000 on liquor and lobster. They were treating his funeral like an overhead cost they had to minimize while treating their party like a lavish investment in their new social status. Amber clapped her hands together in delight. "This is going to be the event of the season," she squealed. "People are going to be talking about this funeral for years." Grandpa Elijah slowly turned his wheelchair away from the screen. He did not say a word. He just wheeled himself over to the window and looked out at the night sky. I walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "They are right, Grandpa," I whispered. "People are going to be talking about this funeral for years, but not for the reasons they think. They are planning a party to celebrate their wealth, but we are planning a party to celebrate their ruin. And trust me, the bill for this event is going to cost them a lot more than money." The camera zoomed in on the dining room table, which had been turned into a command center for what my mother was calling the event of the season. Beatrice sat with a printed guest list in front of her, holding a thick red marker like a weapon. She was not reviewing the list with a heavy heart. She was editing it with the ruthlessness of a corporate executioner. Grandpa Elijah sat beside me in the safe house, leaning forward in his wheelchair. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the names on that paper. They were people he had known for 50 years, his fishing buddies, the deacon from his church, the lady who ran the local food bank. These were the people who had stood by him through thick and thin. But to my mother, they were just obstacles. "Deacon Miller," she said aloud, her voice dripping with disdain. "Delete. He is 90 years old and smells like mothballs. He will just sit there and cry and make everyone uncomfortable." She slashed a red line through the name. Grandpa flinched. Deacon Miller was the man who had baptized me. He was the man who had baptized my father. "Mrs. Higgins." Beatrice continued moving down the list. "The woman brings a tuna casserole to every event. We are serving lobster. She does not fit the aesthetic. Delete." One by one, she erased the people who actually loved my grandfather. In their place, she began writing new names in the margins. Names of people who barely knew Elijah Brooks existed. "Reginald," she called out to my father, who was busy tasting wines. "Make sure we send a VIP invitation to the chairman of the zoning board. If we are going to sell the commercial properties downtown, we need him on our side. This funeral is the perfect time to corner him for a conversation." My father nodded enthusiastically. "Good thinking, Beatrice, and add the vice president of the bank. I want him to see that we have liquid assets now. It will help with our credit score." Then Trey chimed in from the couch where he was texting. "Yo, Mom, make sure you save a table for my boys. I invited the promoters from Club Onyx. And I got a couple of Instagram models coming through. They are going to live stream the service. It is going to be great exposure for my personal brand." I watched in horror. They were turning a solemn memorial service into a networking mixer and a social media stunt. They were filling the seats with Sharks politicians and influencers while banning the loyal friends who would have actually grieved. Grandpa Elijah turned away from the screen. His hands were shaking not from age but from a deep, boiling anger. "They do not want a funeral," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "They want a trade show. They are trading my memory for favors." He looked at me, and for the first time I saw the sadness completely vanish from his eyes. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. Let them invite the sharks, Dominique, he said. Let them fill the room with the most powerful people in the city. Let them bring the cameras and the influencers. Because when I walk through those doors, I want the whole world to see exactly what kind of monsters they are. They want an audience. Fine. I will give them a show they will never forget. Beatrice finished her editing with a flourish of the red marker. There she said, leaning back with a satisfied smile. No dead weight, just power players. This is going to be perfect. She had no idea that the only power player who mattered was sitting in a wheelchair 5 miles away waiting for his cue to enter stage left. The digital invitation landed in my inbox like a grenade. It was not a somber notification of a memorial service. It was a glittery animated graphic that looked like a flyer for a nightclub opening in Miami. The text flashed in gold letters across the screen. The Elijah Brooks Celebration of Life. Saturday night. The theme was listed in bold capital letters at the bottom. All white attire only. Strict dress code enforced. I stared at the screen. My grandfather was a man of tradition. He believed in black suits for funerals. He believed in solemnity. My family was turning his final farewell into a fashion show inspired by a hip-hop music video. Before I could even process the absurdity of it, my phone rang. It was Amber. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was holding up. She skipped straight to the logistics. Did you see the invite, Dominique? She asked, her voice clipped and professional. It is going to be stunning. We have white roses, white drapes, and white carpet. It needs to look heavenly for the Instagram photos. I took a deep breath. I assumed this meant I needed to go buy a white dress. I started to ask her if a cream-colored suit I owned would be appropriate. Oh no, honey, she interrupted, letting out a sharp laugh. You misunderstand. The all-white dress code is for the guests. It is for the family and the VIPs. You are not attending as a guest, Dominique. You are attending as the logistics coordinator. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. What are you talking about, Amber? I am his granddaughter. Technically, yes, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. But visually, you do not really fit the aesthetic we are going for. Look, we need someone to manage the catering staff and show the servers where to put the dirty dishes. If you wear white, people might confuse you for someone important. It would just be confusing for the investors. She paused to take a sip of something on her end. I need you to wear black, she commanded. And not that nice black cocktail dress you wore to Christmas. Wear something plain. Something modest. Something that says, I am here to work, not to shine. We need you to blend into the background. Think of yourself as a shadow. We want the photos to focus on the successful members of the family. I looked over at Grandpa Elijah. He was sitting in his wheelchair, polishing the brass buttons on his vintage military dress uniform. He was preparing to walk into that room looking like a general. Meanwhile, his grandson's wife was ordering me to dress like a maid. Grandpa had heard everything. He stopped polishing. He did not look angry anymore. He looked determined. Let her dress you in rags, Dominique, he said quietly. Let them think you are invisible. The servant always hears the secrets that the masters speak when they think no one is listening. I put the phone back to my ear. My voice was steady. Understood, Amber. I will wear my old black work slacks and a plain shirt. I will stay in the shadows. Perfect, she chirped. Make sure you use the service entrance around the back. We do not want you cluttering up the red carpet arrival photos. I hung up the phone. She wanted me to look like the help. She wanted me to be invisible. She had no idea that by forcing me into the shadows, she was giving me the perfect cover to destroy them. I would wear black. It was appropriate after all. I was the only one dressing for the funeral they did not know was coming for them. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Onyx Room, which is widely known as the most expensive steakhouse in the city. The lighting was dim, and the air smelled of truffle oil and aged beef. I stood near the service entrance wearing the plain black outfit Amber had ordered me to wear, looking more like a waitress than the granddaughter of the deceased. I was not seated at the long mahogany table. I was standing there because someone had to sign the receipts and manage the waiters. My father had put the reservation on my credit card, claiming that the estate accounts were temporarily frozen until Monday, but promising that he would reimburse me with a bonus. I knew I would never see that money again, but I swiped the card anyway. I wanted the paper trail. I wanted proof that while they claimed to be mourning, they were actually feasting on Wagyu beef and lobster tails on my dime. Trey was seated at the head of the table where Grandpa Elijah should have been. He was already 3 martinis deep, and his face was flushed with a sloppy arrogance. He held a skewered shrimp in one hand and gestured wildly with the other, playing to the audience of sycophants and business partners my mother had invited. "You guys have to hear this one," Trey shouted, slurring his words slightly. "So last Thanksgiving the old man is sitting there, right, and he looks at the turkey and he goes, 'Who cooked this bird?' And we are like, 'Grandpa, it is a turkey, not a bird.' He was so out of it, so out. He did not even know what year it was half the time. He probably thought he was still in the 1950s. The table erupted in laughter. It was a loud, raucous sound that had no place in a gathering meant to honor a life. My mother Beatrice wiped a tear of mirth from her eye. "Oh, stop it, Trey," she giggled, taking a sip of her Pinot Noir. "You are terrible." "But it is true." Dad was losing his marbles towards the end. "Remember when he tried to tell you how to run your business? He thought you could still buy a house for $10,000. He was just so disconnected from reality." Amber chimed in, leaning her head on Trey's shoulder. "It was honestly a mercy that he passed when he did. It must be so hard to live when your brain is just mush. At least now the assets are in the hands of people who actually understand the modern economy." I clenched my fists at my sides. Grandpa Elijah did not have dementia. He was sharp as a tack until the day he faked his death. The only reason he asked who cooked the turkey last year was because my mother had burnt it to a crisp, and he was trying to be polite about the taste. They were rewriting history. They were painting him as a senile, incompetent old fool to justify their takeover. They were mocking the man who had paid for the clothes on their backs and the food in their mouths. Trey raised his glass for a toast. To Grandpa Elijah, he announced with a smirk. "Thanks for the money, old-timer. We will take it from here." Everyone clinked glasses, shouting, "Hear, hear." I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was a text from the bank alerting me that the bill for this dinner had just hit $5,000. I looked at the table. They were laughing, eating, and drinking my money while spitting on my grandfather's grave. I signaled the waiter to bring another bottle of the most expensive champagne. "Keep it coming," I whispered to the server. "Let them get drunk. Let them get comfortable. Because tomorrow, when they wake up with a hangover, they are going to find out that the old man they called senile is the one who holds the cure, and he is not sharing." While my family was sleeping off their expensive hangovers in their comfortable beds, Grandpa Elijah was already awake in the guest room of my safe house. The sun had not yet risen, but the lights in the bathroom were blazing. I stood in the hallway watching him through the crack in the door. For the past 3 days I had seen a hurt, confused old man. But the man standing in front of the mirror this morning was a stranger. He had set aside his usual soft flannel pajamas. On the counter lay a straight razor, the kind that required a steady hand and a sharp eye. Grandpa applied the shaving cream with a brush, his movements precise and rhythmic. He did not look like a man trembling with age. He looked like a man preparing for battle. I watched as he pulled the skin taut and scraped away the gray stubble. With every stroke of the blade, it seemed as if he was peeling away the mask of the senile, helpless grandfather my family had mocked. He was revealing the square jaw and the steely expression of the man who had built a dynasty from nothing. Once he was clean-shaven, he reached for the scissors. He trimmed his own hair, cutting away the unruly white strands until he looked sharp and disciplined. He splashed cold water on his face and stared at his reflection. His eyes were no longer watery or sad. They were burning with a cold, blue fire. It was the look of a predator who had finally decided to stop playing dead. He walked, not wheeled, but walked with the help of his cane to the bed where I had laid out his clothes. I had offered to buy him a new suit, but he had refused. He wanted to wear his dress uniform from his days in the military. It was a deep midnight blue adorned with gold braid. It smelled of cedar and history. I watched him button the jacket. It was a little tight around the chest, but he stood tall, sucking in his breath, forcing his body to remember the posture of a soldier. He picked up his medals one by one. The Purple Heart, the Silver Star. Medals he had earned bleeding for his country. My family thought his greatest achievement was owning real estate. They had forgotten that before he was a businessman, he was a warrior who had survived things that would have broken my father in a second. He pinned the medals to his chest. The metal clinked softly in the quiet room. He adjusted his collar and picked up his cane. It was not just a walking stick today. It looked like a scepter. It looked like a weapon. I stepped into the room. "You look handsome, Grandpa," I whispered. He turned to look at me. He did not smile. His face was set in stone. "I am not trying to look handsome, Dominique," he said, his voice dropping an octave deeper than usual. "I am trying to look like the man they forgot. They think they are going to a funeral to cry over a weak old man. They are wrong. They are walking into a court-martial, and I am the judge." He checked his pocket watch. It was time. "Get the car," he commanded. "The general is ready to inspect the troops." As I walked him to the car, I realized something terrifying. My family was worried about ghosts haunting them. They should have been worried about the living, because the man sitting in my passenger seat was far more dangerous than any spirit. He was a father who had realized his children were wolves, and he had just loaded his rifle. I was standing in the hallway, sorting through a stack of condolence cards, when I heard a scream coming from the master bedroom upstairs. It was not a cry of grief or a wail of sorrow. It was the high-pitched shriek of a woman who had just realized she had been cheated out of a payday. My mother, Beatrice, came storming down the grand staircase, clutching a black velvet jewelry box in her hand, as if she wanted to strangle it. Her face was flushed a deep, angry red, and her eyes were bulging. "You thief!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You ungrateful little thief! Where are they? Where did you hide them?" I looked at her calmly, placing the cards on the entry table. I asked her what she was talking about, but I already knew. "Do not play dumb with me, Dominique," she spat, throwing the velvet box at me. It hit my chest and fell open, revealing a sparkling diamond necklace and matching earrings. "These are fake. I just took them to the jeweler to get them appraised for the insurance policy." He laughed at me. He told me they are paste. They are costume jewelry worth maybe $50 at a pawn shop. She stepped closer, invading my personal space. "Grandma's collection was appraised at over $200,000. There were real diamonds. There were South Sea pearls. And now they are gone. You are the only one who had access to this house. You are the only one who visited that old man every week. You swapped them out, didn't you? You stole the real inheritance and left us with glass." I stared at the necklace on the floor. My mother was accusing me of the exact crime she was currently committing. She was trying to loot the estate before the body was even cold, but she was furious that someone might have beaten her to it. "I did not take anything, Mother," I said, my voice steady. "Maybe Grandma sold them years ago. Maybe she wanted to donate the money." "Liar," she hissed. "Your grandmother never sold a thing in her life. You took them. And let me tell you something. As soon as this funeral is over and the guests leave, I am calling the police. I am going to have you arrested for grand larceny. You are going to prison, Dominique. You are not going to enjoy a single cent of that stolen money." I watched her storm off toward the kitchen, pouring herself another glass of wine to calm her nerves. She was so confident in her rage. She had no idea that Grandma's jewelry was sitting safely in a safety deposit box at the First National Bank. Grandpa Elijah had moved them there 5 years ago. He had told me back then that he saw the way Beatrice looked at his wife's diamonds during Christmas dinner. He said she looked at them like a butcher looks at a prime cut of meat. He had replaced them with high-quality replicas just to test her. And now, 5 years later, the trap had finally sprung. She was threatening to call the police on me for stealing. She did not realize that by reporting the missing jewelry, she would be forcing an investigation that would lead directly to the safety deposit box key, which was currently in Grandpa Elijah's pocket. I picked up the fake necklace from the floor. It sparkled under the hallway lights. It looked real enough to fool anyone except a greedy woman trying to cash out quickly. "Go ahead and call the police." "Mother," I whispered to the empty hall. "Please call them. Because when they get here, they are going to find a lot more than just missing jewelry. They are going to find a dead man walking, and a family of thieves caught red-handed." I was standing in the kitchen trying to wash the taste of cheap coffee out of my mouth with a glass of tap water. The house was finally quiet for a moment. My mother was upstairs trying on different shades of white for her funeral outfit, and Trey had passed out on the sofa. I thought I had a moment of peace. I should have known better. My father, Reginald, walked into the kitchen. He did not look at me with the eyes of a parent concerned for his child. He looked at me like a landlord looking at a tenant he wanted to evict. He opened the fridge, took out a bottle of sparkling water, and took a long, slow sip before speaking. "Dominique, we need to talk about logistics," he said, his voice casual as if discussing the weather. I put my glass down. "What logistics, Father?" "The catering is handled. The flowers are ordered." "I am not talking about the funeral," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I am talking about your living situation. You know that studio apartment downtown, the one I co-signed for when you graduated college?" I nodded slowly. I paid the rent on that apartment. I paid the utilities. The only reason his name was on the lease was because 10 years ago, I did not have a credit history. I had never missed a payment. In fact, I had paid off the entire year in advance last month. "Well, Trey needs it," Reginald said. I stared at him. "Trey has a 4-bedroom house. Why does he need my 400-square-foot studio?" "He is expanding his business," Reginald explained, puffing out his chest. "You know he is getting into the vintage sneaker resale market. He has hundreds of boxes of limited edition Jordans and Yeezys. He needs a climate-controlled storage unit that is secure. Your apartment is perfect. It is close to the city center and it has good security, so I promised him he could have it." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You are kicking me out of my home so your son can store his shoes." "Do not be dramatic, Dominique," he scoffed. "It is not your home. It is an asset, and right now it is being underutilized. You are hardly ever there anyway with your work. Trey needs the space to build his empire. Those shoes are an investment." He took another sip of water. "I want you out by Monday. Pack your things this weekend. Whatever you leave behind we will just donate or throw away. Trey wants to start moving the boxes in on Tuesday morning." "Where am I supposed to live?" I asked quietly, gripping the edge of the counter. Reginald shrugged. "You are a smart girl. You will figure it out. Get a roommate. Or stay at a motel for a while. You have a job. Stop expecting me to coddle you. Besides, this is what is best for the family. Trey is the future. We need to support his vision." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my knuckles turning white. He was evicting his own daughter to make room for rubber and leather. He was prioritizing his son's hobby over his daughter's shelter. I looked up at the smoke detector where another camera was hidden. Grandpa Elijah had heard every word. "He thinks he can kick me out," I whispered to the empty room. "He thinks his name on the lease gives him power. He forgot to check who actually owns the building." I pulled out my phone and opened my real estate portfolio app. There it was. The building on 5th Street, acquired by my holding company 3 years ago. My father was not my landlord, I was his. And if he thought he was moving sneakers into Unit 4B, he was in for a rude awakening. I was not going to move out. But on Monday morning, I was definitely going to raise the rent on every unit in the building, starting with the one he thought he controlled. The morning of the funeral did not feel like a day of mourning. It felt like the opening night of a Broadway play where the actors were terrible people and the script was a tragedy written by greed. The funeral home was decked out in thousands of white roses just as Amber had demanded. The scent was overwhelming. It smelled like money and deceit. I pulled my car around to the service entrance just as I was told. I was wearing a plain black dress and sensible shoes, looking every bit the part of the downtrodden granddaughter they wanted me to be. The catering staff nodded at me, assuming I was one of them. I walked into the main hall and saw the preparations. It was grotesque. There was a red carpet, a champagne tower, a DJ booth next to the podium. They had turned my grandfather's final farewell into a nightclub opening. But I was not here to arrange chairs. I was here to set the stage for their destruction. I walked over to the table where the family corsages were waiting. I found the ones marked for Beatrice and Amber. They were elaborate silk orchids imported from Thailand, perfect for hiding a secret. I pulled two tiny high-fidelity microphones from my pocket. They were no bigger than a grain of rice, the kind used in corporate espionage. I slipped them deep into the petals, securing them with a dab of invisible floral glue. Just as I finished, Amber swept into the room. She was wearing a white designer gown that looked more like a wedding dress than funeral attire. She saw me and frowned. "Good you are here early," she snapped. "Make sure the champagne is chilled. And fix my corsage. I do not want to prick my finger." I walked over to her, my head bowed in fake submission. I pinned the bugged flower to her dress. She did not even say thank you. She just adjusted the silk petals and checked her reflection in her compact mirror. "You really should have worn some makeup, Dominique," she muttered. "You look like a ghost." My mother arrived next, looking equally ridiculous in a white feather hat. I pinned her corsage too, right over her heart. The heart that was as cold as ice. She patted my cheek with a condescending smile. "Try not to embarrass us today," she whispered. "Stay in the kitchen until the service is over. We do not want the investors to see you moping around." I watched them walk away to greet the first guests. I slipped into the audio-visual booth in the back of the room. The sound technician was a man I had hired personally. He gave me a thumbs up. I put on the headphones. The sound was crystal clear. I could hear Amber complaining about the humidity. I could hear my mother asking if the photographer had arrived. The trap was set. They were walking around with live microphones broadcasting their true selves to my recording device. In an hour, I would connect that feed to the main speakers. The room was filling up with the city's elite. They thought they were here for a party. They had no idea they were about to witness a massacre. The silence in the booth was heavy. It was the deep breath before the plunge. I looked at the empty stage where Grandpa Elijah would soon make his entrance. I smiled. It was showtime. The lights in the banquet hall dimmed, leaving only a single bright spotlight focused on the crystal podium. It was time for the main event. My mother Beatrice glided onto the stage. She paused for effect, looking out at the sea of white-clad guests with a practiced expression of tragic beauty. She pressed a lace handkerchief to her eyes, which I noticed remained completely dry. She leaned into the microphone and let out a trembling sigh that was loud enough to be heard in the back row. My father Elijah was a simple man. She began, her voice quivering with a theatrical vibrato. He did not care for luxury. He cared for family. And oh, how he loved me. I was his little girl. I was the light of his life. I stood in the shadows of the audio booth fighting the urge to vomit. Grandpa Elijah had told me just yesterday that the only time Beatrice ever called him was when her credit card was declined. But the audience ate it up. They nodded solemnly, dabbing their eyes, completely buying the performance of the grieving daughter. And though my heart is shattered, Beatrice continued, her voice gaining strength. She suddenly sounded very businesslike. "I find comfort in knowing that he would want us to move forward. He would want us to thrive. He would want his assets to be managed by those with the vision to grow them, and that is exactly what I intend to do." She stepped back to polite applause and gestured to the side of the stage. "And now, to honor his grandfather's spirit, please welcome the future of the Brooks dynasty, my son Trey." The DJ dropped a heavy bass beat. It was a hip-hop track that rattled the windows. Trey bounded onto the stage wearing white sunglasses and holding a bottle of champagne. He did not look like a pallbearer. He looked like a hype man. "Yo, thank you, Mom!" Trey shouted into the mic, pacing back and forth. "Losing the old man is tough, real tough. But you know Grandpa was a hustler. He built this town. And I know he is looking down on us right now saying, 'Trey, get that money.'" A few of his friends in the front row whooped and cheered. "That is why tonight I am proud to announce the official launch of my new venture." Trey continued signaling for a projection screen to drop down behind him. It was a digital rendering of a neon-lit building with dancers in cages and a VIP section. "We are turning the old community center into the Elijah Lounge," he announced, grinning. "It is going to be the hottest club in the state. Bottle service, valet parking, and a gold statue of Grandpa right in the lobby. We are taking the Brooks legacy to the next level, baby." The crowd erupted in applause. The bankers, the investors, the politicians, they were all clapping. They were cheering for a strip club built on the ruins of a community center my grandfather had built to help at-risk youth. I looked at the monitor. The microphones I had planted in the flowers were picking up everything. As my mother hugged Trey on stage, I heard her whisper clearly through my headphones. "Great pitch, honey." I saw the investors nodding. "We are going to make a fortune tonight." They stood there beaming, waving to the crowd, basking in the adoration. They thought they had just secured their future. They had no idea that behind the black curtain, just 20 feet away, the man whose name they were selling was adjusting his tie and preparing to walk out and cancel the show. The applause for Trey's ridiculous nightclub pitch was finally dying down. The investors were nodding approvingly, sipping their champagne, oblivious to the fact that they were cheering for the demolition of a community landmark. I watched from the control booth as Amber walked off the stage. She stepped into the wings, wiping the fake smile off her face the second she was out of the spotlight. She pulled out her phone and started typing furiously. She thought she was safe. She thought she was alone. But she forgot about the orchid pinned to her chest. I looked at the sound technician. He nodded. I reached out and slid the master fader for Channel 4 all the way to the top. Suddenly, a sharp screech of feedback cut through the room like a knife. The murmuring crowd went silent. Heads turned toward the speakers. And then loud and clear, Amber's voice boomed through the hall with the clarity of a radio broadcaster. "Jesus Christ, is this over yet?" The voice was unmistakable. It was not the sweet, grieving granddaughter-in-law who had just been on stage. It was the voice of a bored, irritated woman. I watched the crowd's reaction on the monitor. A woman in the front row gasped. A banker raised an eyebrow. But Amber was just getting started. "This heat is destroying my blowout," she continued, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "And if I have to hug one more crying old person, I am going to need a chemical peel. That damn old man just had to die on the weekend of the sample sales. I could be in Paris right now. I had a personal shopper appointment booked and everything. But no, I am stuck here in this dusty hall, pretending to care about a guy I barely knew." The silence in the room was deafening. It was heavier than lead. My mother Beatrice froze near the buffet table, her glass of wine halfway to her mouth. Trey stopped high-fiving his friends. Amber was still backstage, completely unaware that her internal monologue was now public knowledge. "At least the inheritance will cover the inconvenience," she sighed into the microphone. "Once we bulldoze that house, I am booking a first-class ticket to Dubai. I deserve a vacation after all this acting. It is exhausting pretending to be sad." On stage, my mother signaled frantically to the DJ to play music to cut the feed. But it was too late. The damage was done. Amber walked back out from the wings, expecting to see admiration. Instead, she was met with a sea of shocked faces. She saw the horror in their eyes. She heard the uncomfortable shifting of chairs. She looked at my mother, who was making a slashing motion across her throat. Amber turned pale. She tapped the microphone on the podium nervously, trying to laugh it off. "Oh, wow," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Technical difficulties, everyone. You know how technology is. It must be some interference." She tried to smile, but her lips quivered. Nobody smiled back. The illusion of the grieving, loving family had just developed its first crack. And I was just getting started with the hammer. The house lights dimmed again. Soft, sentimental piano music began to play over the speakers. The giant projection screen behind the stage flickered to life. The 200 guests tilted their heads back, expecting to see sepia-toned photographs of Grandpa Elijah fishing or holding babies. Instead, they saw the grainy black and white footage of my father Reginald sweating and cursing as he drilled into the floor safe. The sound of the drill on the video was loud and harsh, cutting through the gentle piano music. The crowd gasped collectively. On screen, my father pulled out the old will and kissed it, shouting about being rich. Then the scene cut abruptly to the garage. There was Trey sitting in the vintage Cadillac, deliberately slicing the leather seat with the keys, laughing as he ruined a priceless heirloom. The final clip was the most damning. It was Amber standing in the living room holding the beautiful framed photo of Grandpa holding me as a baby. The audience watched in horrified silence as she called it bad energy and dropped it into the trash can, dusting off her hands with a look of pure disgust. The video ended and the screen went black, but the piano music kept playing a grotesque soundtrack to their humiliation. In the banquet hall, you could hear a pin drop. The bankers, the politicians, the investors, they were all staring at the stage with open mouths. They were not looking at a grieving family anymore. They were looking at vultures. On stage, my mother stood frozen, her face a mask of terror. Trey was looking at his shoes. Amber was clutching the podium so hard her knuckles were white. They were trapped in the spotlight, stripped bare of their lies in high definition. Up in the control booth, I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. I had watched them commit these crimes in secret over the last 3 days. But seeing them replayed on a 20-foot screen in front of everyone they needed to impress felt like justice. The illusion was completely shattered. They had wanted a show. They had wanted everyone to see them. Well, now everyone had. The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick. Nobody moved. Nobody clapped. They were all just waiting for the next shoe to drop. And I was about to drop the biggest one of all. The silence in the room did not last long. It was broken by a guttural roar from my father. Reginald snapped out of his shock and scrambled up the stairs, tripping over his own expensive loafers in his haste to get to the projection screen. He looked like a madman, his face purple with rage, his arms flailing wildly. He lunged at the screen as if he could physically pull the images down with his bare hands. When that failed, he dropped to his knees and began tearing at the cables running along the floor of the stage. "Turn it off!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Kill the feed. Someone kill the damn feed." But the cables he was pulling were just for the decorative lights. The video feed was wireless, controlled securely from my laptop in the locked booth. He looked pathetic, crawling on the stage in his white suit, now scuffed and stained, pulling at random wires, while the loop of him stealing from the safe played over and over again behind him. Below the stage, Trey went into full attack mode. He did not look like a grieving grandson or a savvy business mogul anymore. He looked like a thug. He jumped off the stage and stormed toward the innocent audio-visual technician standing near the speaker stack. Trey grabbed the man by the lapels of his uniform, shoving him backward against the wall. "Who is doing this?" Trey bellowed, spitting in the poor man's face. "I will sue you. I will ruin you. You are fired. Do you hear me? You are done in this town." The technician threw his hands up in surrender, terrified by the sudden violence. "It is not me, sir," he stammered. "The system is locked out. We have lost control of the board." The guests who had been sitting in polite silence just moments ago began to move. But they did not move toward the exits. They did not move to help. Like a synchronized wave, a sea of smartphones rose into the air. The bankers, the politicians, the socialites, they all held their devices high, recording the meltdown. The flash of cameras flickered like a strobe light, illuminating the chaos. They were capturing every second of it. My father's crawling desperation on stage, Trey's violent outburst, Amber's frozen horror. I watched the screen of my phone. The live stream view count was already climbing. This was not just a local scandal anymore. This was viral gold. My family had wanted attention. They had begged for the spotlight. And now they had it. They were trending, but not for their wealth or their legacy. They were trending as the most dysfunctionally greedy family in the state. My mother, Beatrice, seeing the cameras, tried to salvage the situation. She ran to the microphone, waving her hands frantically. "Please, everyone," she pleaded, her voice shrill and panicked. "This is a hack. This is a deep fake created by our enemies. Please put your phones away. This is a private moment of grief." But nobody listened. A prominent investor in the front row stood up and buttoned his jacket. He looked at my mother with a mixture of pity and disgust. "This is not a hack, Beatrice," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "That is your living room. That is your voice. I think we have seen enough." He turned and signaled to his wife to leave. The mask had completely shattered. The illusion of the perfect wealthy Brooks family lay in ruins on the floor, mixed with the white rose petals and the tangled wires. They were exposed naked in their greed, and the audience they had paid so much to impress was now laughing at them. It was total anarchy. It was beautiful. And they were so busy fighting the ghosts on the screen that they did not hear the heavy double doors at the back of the hall slowly creak open. The chaos in the banquet hall was reaching a fever pitch, with people shouting and cameras flashing, but then a sound cut through the noise like a thunderclap. Boom! The heavy double doors at the very back of the hall were thrown open with such force that they banged against the walls. A blinding beam of white light from the lobby spilled into the dim room, creating a dramatic silhouette framed in the doorway. The music stopped. The shouting died down instantly. 200 heads turned in unison toward the entrance. At first, nobody moved. The figure standing in the light was tall and broad-shouldered. He was not in a casket. He was not in an urn. He was standing on his own 2 feet. He took a step forward into the room, and the light caught the gold buttons of his dress uniform. It was Grandpa Elijah. But it was not the frail man in the wheelchair they remembered. He was standing upright, his spine straight as a steel rod, his chest puffed out, displaying his medals. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It sounded like the wind being knocked out of 200 people at once. Then the screaming started. "It is a ghost!" My mother, Beatrice, shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the back of the room. Her face went completely white, and she stumbled backward, knocking over a flower arrangement. "It is a demon! He is haunting us!" My father, Reginald, who had been tearing at wires just seconds ago, froze on his hands and knees. He looked up, and his jaw practically unhinged. He scrambled backward, crab walking across the stage in sheer terror until his back hit the wall. Grandpa Elijah did not say a word. He simply began to walk. He held his heavy wooden cane in his right hand. He did not use it to lean on. He used it to keep time. Clack, step, clack, step. The sound of the wood hitting the marble floor echoed through the silent room like the ticking of a doomsday clock. The guests in the aisle seats scrambled over each other to get out of his way. They pressed themselves against the walls, eyes wide with fear, terrified to touch him. They thought they were looking at a walking corpse. A woman in the 3rd row fainted dead away, but nobody moved to catch her. They were too busy staring at the impossible sight of the man whose funeral they were attending, marching down the center aisle like a general inspecting his troops. Amber peered over the top of the podium where she had been hiding. Her eyes locked onto Grandpa Elijah, and she let out a whimpering sound. She looked at the exit, but the path was blocked by the very man she had insulted on a hot mic just moments ago. Grandpa kept walking. His face was unreadable. He did not look left or right. He did not acknowledge the terrified guests or the flashing phones. His eyes were locked on the stage. He was locked on the 3 people who had betrayed him. The closer he got, the larger he seemed to become. The atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to a heavy, suffocating dread. This was not a reunion. This was a reckoning. He reached the front of the room and stopped at the base of the stairs leading to the stage. He slammed the tip of his cane down one final time. The sound rang out like a gunshot. He looked up at his son, his daughter-in-law, and his grandson. The silence was so deep, you could hear a heartbreak. And then he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a wolf who had just cornered 3 very fat sheep. Grandpa Elijah stood at the bottom of the stairs like an immovable mountain. The shock in the room was palpable, but for my family, the shock was quickly replaced by a frantic instinct for self-preservation. They realized the game was up, but instead of admitting defeat, they decided to double down on the lies. It started with my mother, Beatrice. She realized she could not explain why she was smiling about the funeral proceeds just moments ago, so she went for the oldest trick in the book. "Oh, my heart," she gasped, clutching her chest with a dramatic flair that would have been rejected by a soap opera director. "The shock. It is too much. My poor heart cannot take it." She looked around for a soft place to land, and seeing none, she crumpled gracefully onto the stage floor. She made sure to adjust her skirt as she fell so she would not look unflattering. She lay there, fluttering her eyelids, letting out little moans of distress, hoping that someone would call an ambulance so she could be carried out of this nightmare on a stretcher. But nobody moved. The guests just stared at her performance with dry eyes. Even my father Reginald stepped over her prone body in his rush to get to Grandpa. Dad Reginald shouted, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal of forced relief. "Praise the Lord. It is a miracle. The hospital told us you were gone. We were devastated, Dad. We were absolutely broken. We were just trying to hold it together for the family." He reached out as if to hug Grandpa, but stopped short when Grandpa lifted his cane just an inch off the ground. It was a warning. "Do not touch me." Reginald froze, his hands hovering in the air, his smile twitching nervously. But it was Amber who delivered the performance of a lifetime. She did not faint. She went on the attack. She realized that the videos and the audio recordings were damning. She needed a scapegoat, and she needed one fast. Her eyes darted around the room until they landed on the control booth where I was standing. "It is a trap!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the back of the room. Tears suddenly sprang from her eyes, as if she had a switch. "Grandpa, do not listen to those recordings. It is her. It is Dominique." Amber ran down the stairs, risking a broken ankle in her high heels, and threw herself at Grandpa's feet. She grabbed his hand, clinging to him like a frightened child. "She set us up!" Amber sobbed, her voice rising in hysteria. "She has been jealous of us for years, because she is the black sheep. She hacked the system, Grandpa. She used AI to create those videos. That was not us saying those things. She made deepfakes to ruin your reputation and tear this family apart. We love you. We would never say those things. She is trying to frame us because she wants the inheritance for herself." Trey jumped on the bandwagon immediately. "Yeah, Gramps," he shouted from the stage, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That video of me in the car was CGI. You know how good computers are these days? Dominique is a programmer, right? She whipped that up to make me look bad. I would never scratch the caddy. I love that car. We are the victims here." I watched from the booth in disbelief. Their audacity was boundless. They were standing in front of the man they had robbed, the man they had mocked, and they were looking him in the eye and telling him that his own eyes and ears were lying to him. They were willing to burn me at the stake to save their own skins. Grandpa Elijah looked down at Amber, who was weeping onto his polished shoes. He looked at his son, who was sweating through his expensive suit. He looked at his grandson, who was lying through his teeth. He did not pull his hand away from Amber. He simply stared at her with a look of absolute pity. He waited for her to finish her sobbing. He waited for the room to go silent again. They really thought he was senile enough to believe that technology could fake the hate in their hearts. They were wrong. Grandpa Elijah looked down at Amber, who was still clinging to his leg. He did not help her up. He shook his leg, freeing himself from her grip with a look of pure disdain. "Get up, Amber," he said, his voice booming through the room without the need for a microphone initially. "Stop embarrassing yourself. You are ruining your white dress." He walked up the stairs to the podium. Reginald scrambled out of his way, cowering like a beaten dog. Grandpa grabbed the microphone. He tapped it twice. Thump, thump. The sound echoed like a heartbeat, proving to everyone that he was solid flesh and blood. "I am not a ghost," he announced, his voice steady and cold. "And I am certainly not a hologram created by a computer. I am a man who had to play dead just to see who was holding the knife waiting to stab me in the back." The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. He looked at his family. "You called me senile. You called me a burden. You tried to sell my home before my body was cold. You are not a family. You are a pack of vultures circling a carcass. But guess what? The carcass is still breathing and it bites back." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a thick document. It was the blue-backed legal paper of a fresh will. "My son thinks he found a will in my safe from 10 years ago. He was right. But laws change, and people change. This document in my hand was signed, notarized, and filed 3 days ago. It supersedes everything." The crowd leaned in. My family held their breath, hoping for a crumb of mercy. There was none. "As of this moment, I am freezing all assets associated with the Brooks estate," Grandpa declared. "The house, the cars, the investments, and the land. None of it belongs to Reginald. None of it belongs to Trey. And it certainly does not belong to the woman who threw my picture in the trash." He turned and pointed directly at the control booth where I was standing in the shadows. "Everything I own is hereby transferred into the Brooks Family Charitable Trust. The sole executor and trustee of this fund is the only person in this room who knows the meaning of loyalty. My granddaughter Dominique. She controls every dime. She decides who gets paid. And judging by what I saw on that screen tonight, I do not think she is going to be writing any checks for bottle service or luxury vacations." My father fell to his knees, his face gray with shock. Trey looked like he was going to be sick. "You wanted to cut me out," Grandpa continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You wanted to erase me. Well, I am returning the favor. From this day forward, you are cut off. You will not see a penny. You will not step foot in my house. You are strangers to me. You wanted to be rich. Well, you are welcome to go out there and earn it like everybody else. But the Bank of Elijah is officially closed forever." The flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers cut through the stained glass windows, bathing the banquet hall in a chaotic disco of colors. The sound of heavy boots hitting the marble floor echoed through the room as 4 uniformed officers marched down the center aisle. They moved with a purpose that terrified the guests who were already reeling from the resurrection of my grandfather. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide path. The officers did not stop at my father, who was still kneeling on the floor. They did not look at my mother, who was feigning a heart attack. They headed straight for the stage where Trey was trying to inch his way toward the back exit. "Trey Brooks," an officer shouted, his voice commanding and loud. "Stop right there!" Trey froze. He looked at the police, and then he looked at the crowd. For the first time in his life, his charm and his family name were not going to save him. He tried to puff out his chest. He tried to look important, but his lower lip was trembling. "What is this about?" Trey stammered, trying to sound offended. "We are in the middle of a funeral. Have some respect." "You are under arrest for grand larceny, forgery, and fraud," the officer stated, pulling a pair of metal handcuffs from his belt. "We have a warrant for your arrest issued this evening." Trey laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Fraud. You guys are crazy. I have not done anything." The officer stepped onto the stage and grabbed Trey's wrist, twisting it behind his back. "The buyer you took a $20,000 cash deposit from this morning disagrees," the officer said. "You sold a 1965 Cadillac DeVille to a private collector. You provided a title with a forged signature. You claimed the owner was deceased, and you had power of attorney." I watched from the booth as the color drained from Trey's face. He had been so confident that Grandpa was dead and the house was his that he had pre-sold the vintage car to fund his nightclub project. He had forged Grandpa's name on the transfer papers, thinking nobody would ever check. "But he is dead," Trey shouted, struggling against the handcuffs. "The old man is dead. I inherited it. The officer spun Trey around and pointed directly at Grandpa Elijah, who was standing just a few feet away, leaning on his cane, watching the arrest with a look of grim satisfaction. "The owner looks very much alive to me," the officer said. "And since he is alive, that means you sold stolen property. That is a felony, son." My mother, Beatrice, suddenly sprang to life, forgetting her fake faint. She lunged at the police officer, grabbing his arm. "Get your hands off him!" she shrieked, her voice sounding like a banshee. "He is a good boy. He made a mistake. He is the heir to the Brooks dynasty. You cannot arrest him like a common criminal." The officer shook her off without even looking at her. "Ma'am, step back or you will be joining him for obstruction of justice." The metal cuffs clicked shut around Trey's wrists. The sound was final. The golden child. The boy who had never been told no. The boy who had been given everything on a silver platter was now being treated like the thief he was. Trey looked at Grandpa pleadingly. "Grandpa, tell them. Tell them you gave me the car. Do not let them take me to jail. I cannot go to jail, Grandpa." Grandpa Elijah looked at his grandson. He looked at the tears streaming down Trey's face. He looked at the handcuffs. "I never gave you that car," Grandpa said, his voice cold and hard. "And I never signed that title. You wanted to be a big businessman, Trey. You wanted to make deals. Well, you just made a deal with the law. Now you have to pay the price." The officers dragged Trey off the stage. He was kicking and screaming, begging for his mother, begging for a lawyer, begging for mercy. The guests held up their phones, filming every second of his humiliation. The live stream comments were going wild. The prince of the Brooks family was being hauled away in disgrace, leaving his white suit wrinkled and his reputation destroyed. As they shoved him through the double doors, I felt a sense of closure. He had spent his life stealing the spotlight. Now he finally had a mugshot to match. The blue lights of the police cars faded into the distance, taking my brother with them. The banquet hall was silent again, save for the nervous murmurs of the guests who were witnessing the collapse of an empire in real time. My father, Reginald, stood center stage, looking like a man who had just survived a plane crash, only to realize he was stranded in a shark tank. He was shaking. He was muttering to himself about money, about lawyers, about a man named Silas. He was terrified of the loan shark he thought was coming to collect. I stepped out of the control booth and began my walk down the long aisle. I did not walk like a servant anymore. I walked like a CEO. I walked straight up to the stage where my parents were cowering. My father looked up at me. His eyes were red and desperate. "Dominique," he croaked, his voice trembling. "You have to help us. I borrowed money. A lot of money. From bad people. If I do not pay them back by Monday, they are going to hurt me. They are going to take everything." I reached into my bag and pulled out a crisp legal folder. I opened it slowly, letting the silence stretch out. "You mean this loan?" I asked, holding up the promissory note. "The one for $500,000, originated by Silas Thorne." My father's eyes widened. "How did you get that?" "I bought it," I said calmly. "I purchased the debt 2 nights ago through my holding company." "Silas does not own you anymore, Father. I do." He blinked, confused. "But why?" "That is great news. We can work something out. You are family. You can give me an extension. You can forgive the interest, right?" I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that cut through his hope like a blade. "An extension." "You tried to evict me from my own apartment yesterday. You made me scrub the floor on my knees while you laughed. There are no extensions. There is no forgiveness." I flipped the page to the collateral section. "Here is the problem." I continued, my voice projecting to the back of the room so every guest could hear. "You secured this loan using Grandpa's estate as collateral. You pledged a house you do not own. But as we have just established, Grandpa is alive. That means the collateral is void. That means you committed fraud on the loan application. That triggers an immediate default clause." I looked him dead in the eye. The entire balance of $550,000, including the penalty fees, is due right now. Tonight. But we do not have that kind of cash, my mother screamed, stepping forward. We spent it. We spent it on the deposit for the penthouse and the party. We are liquid. I know, I said, closing the folder with a snap. Which brings me to the asset seizure clause. Since the primary collateral is invalid, I am legally entitled to seize all personal assets of the borrower to satisfy the debt. I pointed to the door. That means I am taking your condo downtown. I am taking the Mercedes parked outside. I am taking your jewelry, Beatrice. And I am taking your retirement accounts. I have already filed the liens. By tomorrow morning, you will not be socialites. You will be homeless. My father dropped to his knees, sobbing, clutching at my hem. You cannot do this. We are your parents. Where will we go? I pulled my dress away from his grasp, feeling absolutely nothing. You told me I could sleep in a motel, I said. I suggest you find one that takes cash because your credit cards are already canceled. You are not my parents anymore. You are a bad investment, and I am liquidating the asset. The red taillights of the police cruiser faded into the night, taking Trey and his stolen dreams to the county jail. On the stage, my mother Beatrice reached out a trembling hand toward Amber. She was looking for an ally, a partner in misery. She thought that because they were both losing everything, they would cling to each other for support. She was wrong. Amber looked down at my mother not with sympathy, but with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She stepped back, wiping her hand on her dress as if my mother were contagious. The mask of the doting daughter-in-law did not just slip, it shattered into a million sharp pieces. "Do not touch me!" Amber screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. "Do not you dare touch me, you pathetic old woman!" The room gasped. Amber was not done. She turned to face the crowd, her face twisted into a snarl of ugly rage. She had spent years pretending to embrace our culture, pretending to love our traditions, but now the truth came pouring out like toxic sludge. "I am done with this charade," she yelled, pacing the stage like a caged animal. "I wasted 3 years of my life with this family. I thought I was marrying into a dynasty. I thought I was marrying royalty. But look at you. You are nothing but a bunch of ghetto scammers in rented suits." She pointed a manicured finger at Grandpa Elijah. "I lowered myself to be with you people," she spat. "I endured your loud parties and your food and your embarrassing little traditions. I smiled for the cameras while I was dying inside because I thought there was a payout at the end. I thought I was earning my place in high society. But you are not high society. You are just trash with a credit card limit." Her words hung in the air, thick with prejudice and hatred. She was attacking the very identity of the family she had sworn to love. She called us loud. She called us trash. She used every coded insult she could think of to separate her whiteness from our blackness, to show that she had always believed she was better than us. "I want a divorce," she shrieked, looking around for a lawyer in the crowd. "I want an annulment. I want out of this family immediately. Trey is a broke felon and I am a star. I am a brand. I cannot be associated with this level of failure." She pulled out her phone to call her agent but stopped when she saw the screen. Her notifications were scrolling so fast they were a blur. She tapped on her Instagram app. Her follower count was dropping by the thousands every second. The comments section on her latest post was a flood of angry emojis and hashtags calling for her cancellation. "What is happening?" she whispered, tapping the screen frantically. "Why am I losing followers?" I stepped forward and pointed to the large projection screen behind her. It was still mirroring the live feed from the event. The camera was zoomed in tight on her face. Every hateful word, every racist insult, every scream had been broadcast live to her 2 million followers. "You wanted to be a brand, Amber?" I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "Well, congratulations. You are trending worldwide right now. But I do not think your sponsors are going to like the new you." Amber watched in horror as emails started popping up on her screen. Dropped by the fashion label, dropped by the makeup company, dropped by her agency. In the span of 5 minutes, she had gone from a celebrated influencer to a social pariah. She looked up at the camera, her eyes wide with panic, but there was no taking it back. The internet never forgets, and she had just given them a performance they would hate watch forever. She dropped her phone to the floor where it cracked just like her future. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway of the estate my parents had bragged about for 20 years. It was a beautiful house with manicured lawns and stone pillars, but today it looked cold and uninviting. I pulled up in my car right behind the county sheriff cruiser. The blue lights were not flashing this time, but the presence of the law was heavy in the air. I stepped out of the car clutching the writ of possession in my hand. This was the final step. The legal transfer was complete, and now it was time for the physical removal. Sheriff Miller walked up the stone steps and knocked firmly on the solid oak door. It took a moment before it opened. My father Reginald stood there. He was still wearing the same suit from the funeral, but now it was rumpled and stained. He looked at the sheriff, and then he saw me standing a few feet back. His face crumbled. He did not look like the arrogant man who had tried to evict me just 2 days ago. He looked like a frightened child. "Mr. Brooks," the sheriff said, his voice calm but authoritative, "I am here to execute the writ of possession. This property has been seized by the creditor due to default. You have 15 minutes to gather your personal essentials and vacate the premises." My mother Beatrice appeared behind my father. Her face was swollen from crying. She looked around wildly, expecting a moving truck or a team of lawyers to save her. But there was only me and the sheriff. "You cannot be serious," Beatrice cried, running down the steps to grab my arm. "Dominique, this is our home. We raised you here. You cannot kick us out on the street like dogs. Think about what the neighbors will say." Even in her darkest hour, she was worried about the neighbors. I gently removed her hand from my arm. "The neighbors do not matter anymore, Mother," I said quietly. "And this is not your home. It belongs to the holding company now. Do you remember what you planned for Grandpa? You were going to toss his things in a dumpster and sell his house before he was even buried. Do you remember telling me to go sleep in a motel because Trey needed my apartment for his sneakers?" I looked at my father, who was leaning against the doorframe for support. "I am just following the precedent you set," I told them. "I am treating you exactly how you treated us. You have 14 minutes left." The next quarter of an hour was a blur of frantic shouting and weeping. The sheriff stood by the door, checking his watch, ensuring they did not damage any property on their way out. They came out carrying 2 black garbage bags filled with clothes and a few toiletries. It was a poetic image. They had spent their lives chasing designer labels and luxury goods, but in the end, they were leaving with trash bags. The sheriff closed the heavy front door and placed a bright orange padlock on the handle. He taped the seizure notice to the wood. The sound of the lock clicking shut echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a gavel striking a desk. It was done. My father stood on the curb, looking at the house he had lost. He looked small and defeated. My mother sat on her suitcase, weeping into her hands. They had nowhere to go. Their credit was ruined. Their reputation was destroyed. And their family was gone. I got into my car and started the engine. I did not roll down the window to say goodbye. I did not offer them money for a hotel. I simply put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving them standing on the side of the road as the sun finally set on their greed. They were finally experiencing the cold, hard reality they had forced on so many others. They were on the outside looking in. I put the car in drive, but before I could hit the gas, a frantic pounding on the passenger side window stopped me. It was my mother, Beatrice. She was not the composed, elegant socialite she had been just hours ago. Her mascara was running in dark streaks down her cheeks, and her designer dress was wrinkled. She looked desperate, she looked broken. But most of all, she looked dangerous, like a drowning woman trying to pull someone else under with her. I rolled the window down, just 3 inches. I did not unlock the door. "Dominique, please," she sobbed, pressing her face against the glass. "You cannot leave me here. I am your mother. I carried you for 9 months. I went through hours of labor for you. I fed you. I clothed you. Does that mean nothing to you?" I looked at her hands clutching the doorframe. Her knuckles were white. She was playing the final card she had left in her deck. The guilt card. She was trying to weaponize biology to save herself from the consequences of her own cruelty. I remembered the labor she spoke of. She had mentioned it at every birthday, not as a joyous memory, but as a debt I owed her. I remembered how she clothed me in hand-me-downs while buying Trey new designer gear. I remembered how she fed me leftovers while she ate steak. "You are confusing biology with motherhood, Beatrice," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "You gave birth to me. That is a biological fact. But you never raised me. You managed me. You treated me like an employee who wasn't performing well." She shook her head, tears flying from her face. "No, that is not true. I love you, Dominique. I was hard on you because I wanted you to be strong. I wanted you to succeed. Everything I did was for you." "Liar," I whispered. "It was never for me. It was for you. You wanted me to marry rich so I could support you. You wanted me to be invisible so I would not outshine you. You did not love me. You tolerated me." She reached through the crack in the window trying to grab my hand. Her fingers brushed my shoulder and I recoiled as if I had been burned. "Please," she wailed, her voice cracking. "I have nowhere to go. I have no money. I am too old to start over. Just give me some cash, or let me stay in your apartment. I will do anything. I will clean. I will cook. Please, Dominique, do not abandon the woman who gave you life." I looked at her pleading eyes. For a second, I felt a twinge of pity. But then I remembered the video of her throwing my baby picture in the trash. I remembered her laughing when my father told me to live in a motel. That pity evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered the truth she needed to hear. "You made a choice a long time ago, Mother. You chose your God, and it wasn't family, it was currency. You loved the money more than you loved your children. You loved the lifestyle more than you loved your soul. You sacrificed us on the altar of your greed every single day." I put my hand on the window control, ready to close the barrier between us forever. "You gambled everything on money because you thought it would keep you warm at night. Well, look at you now. The money is gone, the house is gone, and the daughter you abused is gone. You loved money more than you loved me. And now you do not have either." I rolled up the window. She screamed my name, slapping the glass with her palms, but the sound was muffled now. I took my foot off the brake and pressed the accelerator. The car moved forward smooth and powerful. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. I saw her standing on the curb, a small, shrinking figure in the distance, clutching her garbage bag of clothes. She was finally alone with the only thing she had ever truly cared about herself. I turned the corner and she disappeared from my sight and from my life forever. The streetlights flickered on above them, casting a sickly yellow glow on the two figures huddled on the curb. Reginald pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. His battery was dying, just like his hope. He dialed the number of his brother Marcus. Marcus had always been the soft-hearted one, the one who helped family no matter what. The phone rang once, twice, then connected. Reginald started to speak, his voice desperate and thick with unshed tears. "Marcus, it is me. We are in a tight spot. We need a place to crash just for tonight." The voice on the other end was not warm. It was ice cold. "I saw the video, Reginald. I saw you drilling into Dad's safe while he was supposedly dead. I saw you laughing about his money. Do not ever call this number again. You are dead to me." The line went dead. Reginald stared at the screen in disbelief. His own brother had cut him off. Beside him, Beatrice was trying her own list of contacts. She called her sister. She called the women from her charity board. She called the neighbors she had gossiped with for years. Every single call ended the same way. Voicemail, blocked numbers, or a sharp rebuke before hanging up. One cousin picked up just to laugh at them. "You treated us like peasants for 20 years, Beatrice," the cousin said. "You banned us from your parties because we were not rich enough. Well, now you know how the pavement feels. Enjoy the fresh air." Beatrice dropped her phone into her lap. She looked at Reginald with wide, terrified eyes. The silence between them was heavy. They had spent decades building a fortress of wealth to keep people out. They thought they were elite. They thought they were untouchable. But they had forgotten to build a bridge to anyone who actually cared. They had cultivated envy instead of love. Now the fortress was gone, and there was nobody waiting to catch them. They were not just homeless. They were friendless. The city was full of millions of people, but for Reginald and Beatrice Brooks, the world had never been emptier. They were completely alone in the dark, surrounded only by their garbage bags and the echo of their own burnt bridges. The morning sun sparkled on the water of the Seine River as I sat at a small outdoor cafe in Paris. Across the table, Grandpa Elijah was breaking a fresh croissant. He looked 10 years younger. The gray pallor of stress was gone, replaced by a healthy rosiness in his cheeks. He was laughing at a joke I just told, his eyes twinkling with a joy I had not seen in decades. We were free. We were traveling the world using the money he had earned to build memories instead of hoarding it for vultures. Thousands of miles away, the picture was very different. In a cold gray cell, Trey was sitting on a metal cot staring at a blank wall. He had traded his white silk suit for a bright orange jumpsuit. There were no VIP sections in prison, only long, empty days to think about the grandfather he had betrayed. And in the back of a greasy diner on the outskirts of town, my parents were finally learning the value of hard labor. My father, Reginald, was hunched over a sink, scrubbing burnt pans, his hands raw and blistered. My mother, Beatrice, was scraping half-eaten food off plates, her expensive manicures long gone, replaced by chipped nails and dishwater hands. They looked exhausted. They looked defeated. They had spent their lives looking down on service workers, and now they were the ones serving. Fate had finally balanced the scales. The kings and queens of greed were in the mud, while the peasant and the old soldier were enjoying the view from the top of the world. I watched Grandpa Elijah leaning back in his chair, watching the boats drift down the Seine. He looked peaceful. The lines of worry that had etched themselves into his face during those final years in that big cold house were gone. He was just a man enjoying his coffee in the sun. Watching him, I realized that everything I had been taught about family was a lie. For years, society told me that blood is thicker than water. They told me that you have to forgive family no matter what they do to you. They told me that honoring your parents is a duty even when those parents treat you like an enemy. I spent my whole life trying to buy their love with my obedience. I swallowed my pride. I hid my success. I let them walk all over me because I was terrified of being an orphan. I was terrified of being alone, but looking at Grandpa, I understood the truth. Biology is just an accident of birth. It is nothing more than shared DNA and genetic traits. It does not guarantee love. It does not guarantee respect. And it certainly does not guarantee loyalty. My parents and my brothers shared my blood, but they were parasites. They drained me dry, and when I had nothing left to give, they tried to discard me. Real family is not about who you are related to. It is about who you choose to stand by when the storm comes. It is about the people who see your value when the rest of the world is blind. Grandpa Elijah is my family, not because his name is on my birth certificate, but because when the world turned its back on me, he held out his hand. We chose each other. We built a bond based on mutual respect and shared integrity. That is stronger than any biological link could ever be. Cutting ties with my parents was not an act of cruelty, it was an act of survival. It was emergency surgery to remove a tumor that was killing my spirit. And now, standing here in the light of a new day, I do not feel guilty. I do not feel sad. I feel lighter. I feel free. The phone in my pocket is silent. There are no more demands for money. There are no more insults wrapped in fake smiles. There is only peace. I turned away from the river and looked directly into the lens. I know there are people out there listening to my voice right now who are feeling the same pain I felt. You are the black sheep. You are the scapegoat. You are the one doing all the work while everyone else takes the credit. You feel trapped by obligation and guilt. I want you to know that you are not crazy. You are not selfish for wanting to be treated with dignity, and you are not alone. You have the power to rewrite your own story just like I did. You have the right to choose who gets a seat at your table. So I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had to make the hard choice to cut off a toxic family member to save yourself? Have you ever felt like a stranger in your own home? Tell me your story in the comments below. Let us build a community of survivors who know that sometimes the best way to find your true family is to walk away from the one you were born into. Do not forget to like and follow for more stories of justice and redemption. Your new life begins the moment you decide you deserve better.